I found out my GF was having an affair with her married boss for a promotion, so I sent all the evidence to his wife and HR department. They both got fired and she became homeless while blaming me. I'm Jerry, 29M, and until 2 weeks ago, I was dating Katie, 28F, for almost 4 years. We met at a friend's party back in college and hit it off immediately despite being complete opposites. She was loud, always the center of attention, cracking jokes and making everyone laugh. I preferred staying in the background, watching people, making the occasional sarcastic comment that would get a few chuckles. Our first 3 years together were solid. We'd spend weekends cooking elaborate meals we found on YouTube, binge-watching true crime documentaries, and planning small trips to nearby cities. Katie worked at a boutique consulting firm downtown while I had a steady job in IT support. Nothing glamorous, but it paid the bills and gave me time to pursue my hobbies. Katie had always been driven about her career. She kept a detailed spreadsheet of her career goals, tracking every project, every client interaction, every performance review. Her plan was simple: make partner by 35, no matter what it took. She'd show me the org chart she'd drawn, pointing out exactly which positions she needed to climb through. I found her ambition attractive at first. She knew what she wanted and wasn't afraid to work for it. About 8 months ago, her firm hired a new regional director named Neil, 45M. Katie came home that first day talking about how impressive he was during the all-hands meeting. Neil had worked at 3 Fortune 500 companies, spoke 4 languages, and apparently commanded the room when he presented the company's new growth strategy. She mentioned he'd personally introduced himself to her after the meeting, commenting on a report she'd submitted the previous quarter. The changes started gradually. Katie began staying later at the office, often texting me around 9 p.m. saying she'd grab dinner near work instead of coming home. She explained that Neil had implemented new client acquisition processes that required additional documentation and strategy sessions. When I asked why she couldn't do this work during regular hours, she said Neil preferred having these planning meetings after the main office cleared out. Less distractions, more focus on big picture thinking. Around this time, Katie also started dressing differently for work. She'd always been professional, but now she was buying expensive blazers, getting her hair done every 2 weeks instead of monthly, and spending way more time on her makeup in the mornings. When I commented on a particularly expensive-looking purse she'd brought home, she brushed it off saying the company had started giving performance bonuses in the form of gift cards to high-end stores. 3 months ago, Katie got passed over for a senior consultant position she'd been eyeing for over a year. She came home that night and went straight to our bedroom without saying hello. I found her an hour later, staring at the ceiling. She told me the promotion had gone to Derek, someone with less experience but who apparently had better relationships with the existing partners. She spent the next hour ranting about how the corporate world rewarded networking over actual competence. That night, she said something that should have been a bigger red flag than it was. She looked at me and said she was tired of being the good girl who played by all the rules while others took shortcuts. She said if she wanted to advance, she needed to learn how to play the game better. I thought she meant she'd start networking more or maybe take on higher profile projects. The late nights became even more frequent after that. Katie would come home after 10 p.m. most weekdays, always with detailed explanations about client presentations or strategy sessions with Neil. She'd mention how Neil was personally mentoring her, teaching her about executive-level decision-making and industry connections. According to her, he was showing her the kinds of skills that separated good consultants from partner-track consultants. Around the same time, Katie's phone habits changed completely. She'd always been casual about her phone, leaving it on counters, asking me to check messages when she was driving, even handing it to me to show funny memes or photos. Suddenly, her phone was always face down on surfaces. She'd take it with her to the bathroom, and she set up a different notification sound that was much quieter. When I asked about it, she said Neil had been sending sensitive client information and she needed to be more careful about confidentiality. The gifts started appearing more frequently too. A spa certificate for a high-end place downtown. A bottle of expensive wine that she said was from a grateful client. New jewelry that she claimed was from a company raffle. What struck me as odd wasn't the gifts themselves, but how she mentioned them. Katie had always been someone who'd excitedly show off anything new, explaining exactly where it came from and why she loved it. With these items, she'd mention them casually, almost dismissively, when I'd noticed them. About 6 weeks ago, I started finding hotel receipts in Katie's car. Not tucked away or hidden, just sitting in the cup holders or on the passenger seat. When I asked about them, she said Neil had been having her scout potential venues for client events and off-site meetings. She'd explained that part of her expanded role involved handling logistics for important presentations. The receipts were always for nice hotels downtown, places that seemed expensive for scouting purposes. 2 weeks ago, everything came crashing down on a Tuesday evening. Katie had come home around 6 p.m., which was earlier than usual. She seemed exhausted and said she needed to shower before we ordered dinner. She left her laptop open on our coffee table, something she'd stopped doing months earlier. I was sitting on the couch, scrolling through my phone, when a message notification popped up on her screen. It was from Neil, and the preview showed, "Hey beautiful, last night was incredible. When can we have our next private strategy session?" The message included a hotel room number and a time for the following evening. I sat there staring at the screen for a few minutes. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to pretend I hadn't seen anything. But I'd spent months watching Katie become someone I barely recognized, and now I had confirmation of what I'd suspected but hadn't wanted to admit. I opened her laptop and went to her messages. What I found was months of conversations between Katie and Neil. Photos sent back and forth. Explicit discussions about hotel meetings. But what made everything worse were the messages about her career. Neil had promised her a promotion to senior consultant by the end of the year, followed by a fast track to partner. In exchange, Katie needed to keep him happy and maintain complete discretion about their arrangement. Reading through the messages, I realized this wasn't some passionate affair that had gotten out of hand. This was a calculated business transaction. Katie had made a deliberate choice to trade her integrity for career advancement. She'd looked at her options after getting passed over for promotion and decided this was her best path forward. I spent the next hour taking screenshots of the most damaging conversations. I created a new email account and sent myself copies of everything: the quid pro quo discussions, the hotel arrangements, the explicit photos. I made sure to delete the sent emails from her account and empty the trash folder so she wouldn't know what I'd found. The next morning, I waited until Katie finished getting ready for work. She was standing in our kitchen, drinking coffee and checking her phone, probably reading messages from Neil. I walked over and said I'd seen the messages from Neil and knew about their arrangement. Katie's face went completely white for about 5 seconds. Then she straightened up and looked directly at me. Instead of apologizing or trying to deny anything, she started explaining why she'd made this choice. She said she'd spent years watching less qualified people get promoted because they knew how to work the system. She called her relationship with Neil a strategic career investment. She said she was thinking about our future together and how this promotion would benefit both of us financially. She actually used the phrase strategic partnership when describing what she'd been doing with Neil. She said I was being naive about how business really worked at the executive level. According to her, successful people understood that sometimes you had to be willing to do things that others weren't comfortable with. She said she was sacrificing her comfort zone to secure our financial future. I listened to her entire explanation without interrupting. When she finished, I told her she was wrong about almost everything. I said she hadn't made a strategic choice, she'd made a lazy choice. Instead of improving her skills or building genuine professional relationships, she'd taken the easiest path available. I said she'd gambled her integrity and our relationship for a shortcut that might not even work out. Katie started getting defensive, saying I didn't understand the pressure she was under at work. She said Neil had specifically chosen her for mentorship because he saw her potential, and their personal relationship had developed naturally from their professional connection. She insisted that she still loved me and that this arrangement was temporary, just until she could establish herself in a more senior role. While she was talking, I walked over to my laptop and opened the email I'd prepared the night before. The recipient was Neil's wife, Linda, whose email address I'd found through a simple internet search. The email contained screenshots of the most explicit conversations between Katie and Neil, along with a brief explanation of their ongoing affair and the career promises involved. I hit send while Katie was still talking. Katie stopped mid-sentence when she saw what I'd done. She asked what I'd just sent and to whom. When I told her, she started shouting that I'd ruined everything over a mistake that had nothing to do with our actual relationship. She said I was being vindictive and destroying her career over something that didn't affect me personally. I told her she'd already ruined everything herself. I said I was just making sure the consequences extended beyond our relationship. Then I packed a bag and went to stay with my brother for a few days. Update 1. The fallout happened faster than I expected. Linda, Neil's wife, responded to my email within 2 hours. She thanked me for the information and said she'd suspected something was happening but hadn't been able to confirm it. She said she'd be taking action immediately and asked if I had any additional information that might be relevant. I forwarded Linda everything I had, all the screenshots, hotel receipts I'd photographed, and a timeline of when Katie's behavior had changed. Linda replied saying she was forwarding everything to her divorce lawyer and to Neil's company's HR department. By Thursday morning, both Neil and Katie had been called into separate meetings with HR. Katie tried calling me repeatedly that day, but I'd blocked her number. She started texting from other people's phones, saying the company was conducting a full investigation and that I'd destroyed both of their careers over a personal relationship that had nothing to do with their work performance. What Katie hadn't realized was that their company had strict policies about supervisor-subordinate relationships, especially when career advancement was involved. The HR investigation revealed that Neil had promised promotions to Katie in exchange for their relationship, which constituted sexual harassment and abuse of power. The company also discovered that Neil had been padding expense reports to cover the hotel costs, turning their affair into a financial misconduct issue as well. By Friday, both Neil and Katie had been terminated. The company's official statement mentioned violations of workplace conduct policies and misuse of company resources. Neil's termination was immediate, and he was escorted from the building that same day. Katie was given until Monday to clean out her desk. Over the weekend, Linda filed for divorce and requested an emergency custody hearing for their 2 kids. She used all the evidence I'd provided to demonstrate Neil's infidelity and poor judgment. Her lawyer argued that Neil had been using marital assets to fund his affair, since some of the hotel expenses had been charged to his personal credit cards that Linda was legally responsible for. The following week, Katie showed up at my brother's apartment where I'd been staying. She looked like she hadn't slept in days. She said she'd been let go from the company and that word was already spreading through their professional network. She said Neil had promised her that their relationship would never become public and that she'd been guaranteed protection from any professional consequences. Katie had also discovered that Neil hadn't been entirely honest with her about his intentions. During their HR interviews, it came out that Neil had similar arrangements with at least 2 other female employees over the past year. Katie wasn't his special mentee, she was just the most recent person willing to participate in his pattern of behavior. She asked if there was any way we could work things out. She said she realized she'd made a terrible mistake and that she wanted to focus on rebuilding our relationship and finding a new job. She promised she'd learned her lesson about mixing personal and professional relationships. I told her I wasn't interested in getting back together. I said her problem wasn't that she'd mixed personal and professional relationships, her problem was that she'd made a calculated decision to trade her integrity for career advancement. I said even if the arrangement with Neil had worked out exactly as she'd hoped, I wouldn't want to be with someone who'd made that choice. Katie started crying and said she'd only done it because she felt stuck in her career and saw an opportunity to accelerate her timeline. She said she thought she could handle the personal complications because the professional benefits would be worth it. She said she'd never intended for our relationship to suffer and that she'd planned to end things with Neil once she got promoted. I told her that her planning made everything worse, not better. I said if she'd had an affair because she fell in love with someone else, at least that would have been an emotional decision made in the moment. Instead, she'd spent months systematically lying to me while pursuing a transactional relationship with her boss. I said I couldn't trust someone who was capable of that kind of long-term deception. Katie asked what she was supposed to do now. She said she'd probably lost her security deposit on her apartment because she couldn't make rent without her job. She said other consulting firms in the area had already heard about why she'd been fired, making it difficult for her to find similar work. She said her parents were disappointed in her and had made it clear she wasn't welcome to move back home. I told her those were consequences of her choices and that I wasn't responsible for helping her manage them. I said she'd gambled her career, our relationship, and her reputation for a promotion that was never guaranteed. I said she needed to figure out her next steps without involving me. Before she left, Katie said she hoped I was happy with how everything had turned out. She said I'd chosen to destroy her career instead of working through our relationship problems like adults. She said most people would have confronted their partner privately instead of involving their partner's workplace and destroying their professional reputation. I told her that most people don't have affairs with their supervisors in exchange for career advancement. I said she'd involved her workplace in our personal relationship the moment she started sleeping with Neil for professional gain. I said I'd simply made sure all the relevant parties had accurate information about what was happening. Update 2. The consequences for both Katie and Neil ended up being more severe than I'd initially expected. Neil's divorce proceedings became particularly ugly when Linda's lawyers discovered he'd been having these arrangements with subordinates for over 3 years. They found evidence of similar relationships at his previous 2 companies, suggesting a pattern of behavior that had followed him throughout his career. Linda was awarded full custody of their children and a significant portion of their shared assets. Neil had to sell their house and move into a studio apartment across town. His professional reputation was completely destroyed when details of the HR investigation became known within their industry network. The consulting firm where Neil and Katie had worked also faced additional scrutiny. An employment lawyer representing one of Neil's previous targets contacted other women who had worked under his supervision. They discovered that the company had received informal complaints about Neil's behavior before but hadn't conducted proper investigations. The firm ended up settling with several former employees and implementing new harassment prevention policies. Katie's situation continued to deteriorate as well. She'd managed to find a temporary position at a much smaller firm, but at a significantly lower salary and with no clear advancement opportunities. The work was mostly data entry and administrative tasks, nothing that utilized her previous experience or education. Her financial problems became more serious when she realized she couldn't afford to maintain her previous lifestyle. She had to give up her apartment and move in with a college friend who lived in a less desirable part of town. She'd also accumulated credit card debt during the months when she was unemployed, and the minimum payments were consuming most of her reduced income. About 6 weeks after our last conversation, Katie contacted me through LinkedIn. She said she'd been thinking about everything that had happened and wanted to apologize for how she'd handled the situation. She said she understood why I'd been angry and that she shouldn't have expected me to keep her secret after discovering her affair. She also mentioned that she'd learned more about Neil's history with other employees and realized she hadn't been as special or unique as she'd believed. She said she felt manipulated and used, and that she wished she'd made different choices when she'd first been approached by Neil. In her message, Katie asked if I thought there was any possibility of us rebuilding a friendship over time. She said she missed talking to me and valued my perspective on things. She said she understood that a romantic relationship wasn't possible, but hoped we could eventually have some kind of positive connection. I didn't respond to her LinkedIn message. Instead, I blocked her on that platform as well. I'd already moved on with my life and didn't see any benefit in maintaining contact with her, even as friends. Around this time, I'd started dating someone new. Jessica, 26F, worked as a nurse at the local hospital and had a completely different approach to life than Katie. She was direct and honest, never played games or tried to manipulate situations for personal advantage. Our relationship developed slowly and naturally, without any of the drama or complications I'd experienced with Katie. Jessica knew about my previous relationship and the circumstances of how it ended. She said she appreciated that I'd handled the situation by addressing it directly instead of ignoring the problem or trying to fix someone who'd made such poor choices. She said it showed her that I had clear boundaries and wouldn't tolerate deception in a relationship. Meanwhile, Neil's problems continued to multiply. His professional network had essentially blacklisted him from senior positions at reputable firms. He'd taken a consulting role with a small company at about half his previous salary. His ex-wife Linda had also been granted a restraining order after he'd shown up at her workplace trying to convince her to reconsider the divorce. The legal fees from his divorce and the employment-related settlements had depleted most of Neil's savings. He'd been forced to declare bankruptcy and was living in a small apartment with minimal furnishings. Several of his former colleagues had publicly distanced themselves from him once details of his behavior became widely known. 3 months after the initial fallout, I received an unexpected phone call from Linda, Neil's ex-wife. She wanted to thank me again for providing the evidence that had allowed her to protect herself and her children. She said the divorce had been finalized and that she'd received everything she'd requested in the settlement. Linda also mentioned that she'd heard Katie was struggling professionally and financially. She said she didn't feel sorry for Katie, but she wanted me to know that she appreciated how I'd handled the situation. She said many people in similar circumstances would have confronted their partner privately and allowed the deception to continue, but that I'd made sure everyone affected had access to the truth. Update 3. The last contact I had with Katie came about 4 months after everything initially happened. She sent me a text from yet another unknown number, asking if I could meet her at a coffee shop near my apartment. She said she had something important to tell me and that it would only take a few minutes of my time. I didn't respond to the text, but I mentioned it to Jessica. She said I should do whatever felt right to me, but that I shouldn't feel obligated to meet with Katie just because she was asking. Jessica said she trusted my judgment about whether any contact with Katie would be beneficial or harmful. The following week, I received a much longer text from the same unknown number. Katie explained that she'd been evicted from her friend's apartment because she couldn't consistently make rent payments. She said she'd been staying in a budget motel for the past 2 weeks but couldn't afford to continue paying the daily rate. In the message, Katie said she'd applied for dozens of positions but kept getting rejected once potential employers learned about the circumstances of her termination from the consulting firm. She said the professional community in our city was smaller than she'd realized, and that word of her situation had spread more widely than she'd expected. Katie also mentioned that her relationship with her family had become increasingly strained. Her parents had initially offered some financial support, but they'd stopped helping when they learned more details about her affair and the career advancement arrangement. She said they were embarrassed by her choices and concerned about how her situation reflected on their family's reputation. At the end of her message, Katie asked if she could stay in my guest room temporarily while she figured out her next steps. She promised she wasn't trying to restart our romantic relationship and that she just needed a stable place to stay while she applied for jobs in other cities where her reputation hadn't been damaged. She said she'd learned her lesson about making unethical choices for professional gain and that she wanted a chance to rebuild her life in a different environment. She said she understood why I was angry but hoped I could find some compassion for her current situation. I showed the message to Jessica, who said she thought Katie was trying to manipulate me by emphasizing how desperate her circumstances had become. Jessica pointed out that Katie had made multiple calculated decisions over several months, and that she was now facing the logical consequences of those choices. I agreed with Jessica's assessment. I sent a brief response to Katie saying that her housing situation wasn't my responsibility and that I wouldn't be providing any assistance. I said she'd made her choices knowing there could be serious consequences, and that she needed to handle those consequences independently. Katie replied immediately, saying she couldn't believe I was willing to let her become homeless over a mistake she'd already paid for by losing her job and her relationship. She said she'd expected me to be angry, but not cruel enough to ignore her when she was genuinely in trouble. I told her that her current problems weren't the result of a single mistake, they were the result of months of deliberate deception and unethical behavior. I said she'd gambled her career, our relationship, and her reputation for a promotion that was never guaranteed, and that she'd lost that gamble. I said I wasn't responsible for mitigating the consequences of her choices. That was the last communication I had with Katie. I blocked the number she'd been texting from and haven't heard from her since. A few weeks later, Jessica and I ran into Linda at a local restaurant. She mentioned that Neil had moved to a different state after finding work with a small firm that apparently hadn't learned about his history. She said he was required to pay child support but had been inconsistent with payments because of his reduced income. Linda also said she'd heard through mutual connections that Katie had eventually found work in a different city, though she didn't know any details about the position or Katie's current circumstances. Linda said she hoped Katie had learned from the experience but wasn't particularly concerned about her well-being. My life has been significantly better since removing Katie from it. Jessica and I have been together for over 6 months now, and our relationship is characterized by honesty, mutual respect, and genuine compatibility. We don't play games or try to manipulate each other for personal advantage. I received a small promotion at work recently, which I earned through consistent performance and professional development. The promotion came with additional responsibilities and a modest salary increase. Jessica was genuinely excited about my success and celebrated with me without any ulterior motives or hidden agendas. I don't regret exposing Katie's affair or providing evidence to Linda and the HR department. Katie made her choices with full knowledge that there could be serious consequences. She decided to risk her integrity, our relationship, and her professional reputation for a chance at accelerated career advancement. When that gamble failed, she faced the natural consequences of her decisions. I've learned that some people will make choices that reveal fundamental incompatibilities in values and character. When those incompatibilities become apparent, the healthiest response is often to remove those people from your life completely rather than trying to fix or save them. Katie's problems were the result of her own actions, and solving them was her responsibility, not mine.